Hi, this is Eric Hess with the Encrypted Economy. And this week we had Natalie Neto, who is a partner at Walker's in Bermuda that covers their digital asset space. We had her on the podcast. Now, I'm going to keep this intro short because I also share a lot in this episode about my own experience pursuing one of the early DABA licenses, digital asset business licenses in Bermuda. I plan on doing more of these country-focused podcasts with episodes coming up on Cayman and UAE and others coming as well. At any rate, if you enjoy this podcast, please like it, share it, get the word out. I recently found out that we were being ranked in Singapore now, which is awesome. At any rate, let's keep it up. So hope you enjoy this podcast with Natalie Neto. Welcome to the Encrypted Economy, a weekly podcast featuring discussions exploring the business, laws, regulation, security, and technologies relating to digital assets and data. I am Eric Hess, founder of Hess Legal Counsel. I've spent decades representing regulated exchanges, broker-dealers, investment advisors, and all manner of fintech companies for all things touching electronic trading with a focus on new and developing technologies. This is Eric Hess with the Encrypted Economy, and I'm delighted today to have Natalie Neto on the podcast. She is a partner in Walker's Bermuda. Welcome, Natalie.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'm really delighted to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
So I'm super excited to have you on the podcast today because we actually had a great opportunity to work together years ago on another digital asset business license in Bermuda. So we had actually bounced around a little bit until we found Natalie, and she was wonderful to work with. And so much has been going on with Bermuda. I even wrote a piece about it last year, comparing, sort of looking across the space for prescriptive regulations, and continued to be impressed by what Bermuda had done with regards to regulation, like a smart approach to regulation. So I'm biased, I'll admit it. But evidently, so are you. So this is going to be a podcast, largely focusing on what Bermuda has done and what you have seen. But before we dig into this, let's talk a little bit about your background and take it from there.
Yeah. So thank you, and the feeling was mutual. It was great to work with you previously, Eric, as well. So I have been in Bermuda for nearly 16 years. Previously, I was trained in the United Kingdom and worked as a private equity lawyer until I came out here in 2006. And since then have worked as a corporate lawyer, and now more recently in the last 4 years, looking in advising and assisting fintech clients across the sort of gamut of regulations that Bermuda was proactive in putting into place starting in 2018. So currently I head up the fintech team here at Walker's. We have a global fintech working group, which is sort of tier one in Chambers, and I'm proud to co-lead that with some colleagues from Cayman. And so I think Walker's as a firm is sort of really happily advising some quality clients around fintech, digital assets across our jurisdictions. But very, very happy to be representing Bermuda in particular, which I think has done some quite innovative and creative things around legislation, which is proving fruitful as a practitioner.
So when you first came to Bermuda, I guess digital assets weren't on the horizon, and they only emerged. And you're like, okay, this is something I can turn to because
I think Bermuda historically has had a sort of history of being innovative, though. So, very, very strong insurance, reinsurance sector in Bermuda. The Bermuda Monetary Authority has been licensing Bermuda insurers and reinsurers for over 50 years, and over 40 years, and has more sort of become known for doing that as sort of the cutting edge. So they are the leading domicile for ILS structures, which it in its day was considered extremely innovative. So I think, when digital assets and fintech sort of exploded, I guess, it didn't really surprise me that the BMA was capable of sort of putting its arms around that and seeing how it could go about licensing it. And you're right, yes, looking at that sort of exciting new opportunity. We had a government in 2017 that announced to the country that it was going to be proactive in a fintech strategy, in actually encouraging fintech companies to come to Bermuda and to innovate. And so it was sort of, it was an exciting time back then, and it's continued to be. So for me, I was really quite excited to get into the space and have a look back.
Excellent. So before we get into what the Bermuda Monetary Authority has done to date with regards to regulation, and I know you touched on it a little bit, but let's frame it a little bit more specifically for digital assets. Why is Bermuda a great jurisdiction for setting up shop for a digital asset business?
Yeah, I mean, and it's a question that we get asked often, especially when there are other jurisdictions that are sort of promoting themselves as innovation islands or various variants on that theme. I think Bermuda has the benefit of having a high degree of credibility when it comes to international investors and customers. So, we find that entities that are looking to branch offshore, which could be for a number of reasons, because they're seeking certainty in the area of regulation, because they are looking to do some things in a more innovative way with a more sort of flexible regulator. They're looking for a jurisdiction in which they can be innovative and flexible, but they won't lose credibility by virtue of that. And I think Bermuda is, obviously I am very biased, but streaks ahead in that regard because of the reputation of the regulator, because we have an international stock exchange that's world renowned. And so, I think that that puts it ahead. I mean, obviously, being in a tax neutral jurisdiction means that you can be flexible again with how you structure your vehicles. We offer as products a number of vehicles to enable you to structure your business in the best way that suits you and in a tax neutral way. And we've got a stable legal system, and I think that again is a stable political climate and a sort of based on English common law legal system. So we have a good amount of jurisprudence, and even in this sort of emerging sector, there is obviously cases being decided around digital assets in the UK in particular, and those would be persuasive here. So we can give some guidance around interpretation of digital assets as a matter of law, property law, trust, etc. So all of that sort of puts us in a great position, and that's without mentioning the BMA, who I do think stand apart from a regulatory perspective in terms of how innovative and collaborative they are prepared to be with businesses in this sector.
Right. And Prime Minister Bert and his team have also been, from my recollection, very accessible, very supportive, very thoughtful in how they've approached the asset class. And, I'll note that, Malta, at the time I was the way that I was introduced to Bermuda was I was sort of looking at Malta, and we were considering other options. And Malta was a lot of companies were crowding into Malta at the time.
Yep.
And they've had their own negative experience. They attracted a large number of blockchain companies, and that backfired. They rejected a number of them when they were mid-process in their applications, maybe setting up shop, maybe having invested in the country, and then being told no dice, right?
Right.
And Bermuda is in an enviable position of not really having had a misstep. You didn't have a flood of applicants coming to the island because the BMA structure doesn't appeal to everybody. Like you do need to be regulated, but it does facilitate, potentially more responsible players coming in.
Yeah, I think you're right. We had a very positive, proactive government strategy that is designed, and let's not, beat around the bush um, to grow the Bermuda economy with respect to job opportunities, training opportunities, growing the talent pool here, and expanding the reliance beyond tourism, which is obviously a difficult sector generally, and expansion of the already kind of strong international business sector. So, it was for good reasons and well thought out, but also because our premier really does believe that this is, the fourth industrial revolution, and is really, it's here to stay, and we should embrace it. And that Bermuda offers a number of advantages for those who want to come and innovate and prove that their models work, their tech works, their framework can be scaled, etc. So there you have that sort of very pro fintech Bermuda government, but then separately and completely independent of government, you have a financial services regulator with a very high degree of credibility internationally, with very high standards. They advertised the Bermuda standard, so it wasn't for everyone. And as a practitioner in the early sort of days of this, that could be a little frustrating, because obviously we wanted to have lots of business come to Bermuda. As this has developed over the last few years, we have realized that Bermuda is for those who want to lean into regulation and to be thoughtful and careful about why they are being regulated, and do it for the right reasons, because you will be required to demonstrate your ability to be regulated and that you have presence in the jurisdiction, at least for certain of the license classes. So it is a serious license, but for that reason, it is regarded well internationally. And, while we're not quite at the passporting stage yet, I know that our regulator is in constant contact with other reputable international regulators, such that if you got a license here, it would be regarded well with respect to any other international licenses that you might be seeking, and vice versa. If you have a license already from an international regulator that is well thought of by our regulator, that will be taken into account, and perhaps materials shared, etc. So, it is about that. And we did see the sort of rush to other jurisdictions which maybe had lower barriers to entry. We didn't have that situation where we sort of welcomed all and anybody. I think, we had to sort of find our feet in the first few years. And so we didn't kind of go out issuing licenses every month. They took a lot longer than they do now to issue, as the authority found its feet in terms of regulating and making sure that the right people were on our shores. And I think they've proved that is the right way to do it from a regulator's perspective. So, it's a balancing act. It's one that, sometimes can be frustrating, but more and more I see that it's the right thing, and more with the benefit of these sort of this approach and the careful and thoughtful process around licensing. The BMA team is second to none as far as I'm concerned. They really do know their stuff, and they'll work with the businesses in a really intuitive way. So ultimately I'm pleased to be here and with a regulator that has developed that kind of strategy, and we're seeing some really good quality businesses, as well as the development of an environment which genuinely fosters innovation. So proper sandboxes with lower barriers to entry, and happy to discuss all of those.
Yeah, I mean, my experience was that it was a thoughtful approach, and the regulators were well versed even at the time and trying to get to the right place, but not necessarily being in a box within a box within a box within a box, which is sort of where we find ourselves in the U.S. with I'm not gonna rant, but a sort of a no compliant pathway for a lot of digital assets, whereas in Bermuda there is a regulatory framework, and the regulators aren't basically not, the regulators are offering a compliant path, and it's a thoughtful path. And, one of the things when I was doing work there with you, and when I wrote the article, it just, they've been so thoughtful about so many things. It's almost like, even if you don't situate in Bermuda, you might want to take a look at their regulation, because in many ways it's a playbook on how to run a digital asset exchange right, with a lot of the principles, a lot of the compliance principles. And again, that's got to help when you go jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And so what types of businesses, digital asset businesses, are drawn to Bermuda today? There's obviously a whole host of them. Which ones in particular find themselves most compelled by the environment there?
Well, so I think a wide range, and one of the reasons for that is because the legislation offers really a good degree of certainty. So we have a number of express classes of digital assets business activity that, if you're doing them in Bermuda, you will require a license, and it's kind of quite clear what those activities are, and it's a license in sort of that takes into account the nature, scale, and complexity of the business and the life cycle of the business. So instead of sort of differing the license criteria depending on what you're actually doing, what they say is, these are the activities that are licensable, and you can apply for a license that takes into account the scale of the operation. So if you are at the early stages, you're a startup, you're innovating, you're proving concept, it's beta stage, we have a license called a Class T license, which has lower barriers to entry, certainly, but it's the same sort of principle. So you would start there, you would be able to come be overseen by the regulator, and they will support you as you scale up. We then have the Class M, which is a modified version of the Class F license, which is the full license. And so the Class P and the Class M I just mentioned, they're for a defined period. Again, so you kind of scale up under the regulatory supervision of the BMA. You can build out your compliance framework. As you say, they have sort of set a number of the international standards around, or they certainly adopt international standards around how you build that compliance framework. And a lot of the feedback we've had from our sandbox licensees is that the supervisory process has helped them grow their business carefully, thoughtfully, prudently, robustly, and taking into account risk. So BMA's approach is risk-based, proportionate, and not rules-based. So you won't find too much prescription. You'll have guidance. You'll have expectations as to what they would expect you to have for a certain class of license in place. But they look to the business to develop that, to really own its own risk and compliance framework, to own its, understand its own business, develop a business that is viable. And so that kind of works. Yeah, I mean, it's in terms of the type of businesses, we have licensed full crypto exchanges here. We have seen a lot of interest around crypto lending, broking. We have payment service providers. We have been working around custodians. We've yet to have a Bermuda qualified custodian, licensed custodian. I'd love to see that in the future. And we have as well banks which are offering digital assets business solutions that are seeking licenses in Bermuda, because there's the flexibility to do that here within two licensing frameworks. The other thing about Bermuda that's great is if you have a dual licensing requirement, because you are, for example, a bank or a digital assets business, or an insurance company and a digital assets business, under our pieces of legislation, you're pointing at the same regulator, and what they'll do is they'll assemble at one team to deal with the applications. So you'll get those licenses in a parallel track, and so there's no duplication. So again, that thoughtfulness really plays over well. We are seeing a lot of interest in, trading activities, as you can imagine, and derivatives trading in particular, because the BMA is risk-based, they don't have prescriptions around limits, margin trading, leverage. They expect you to be able to support your proposed business model, to be able to have risk controls and measures in order to prudently protect customers and investors. And if you can demonstrate that to their satisfaction, then you've got a good chance of getting a license. But again, back to the point about sort of getting along the track and then having to be told that you can't have the license. my experience is that you will receive that message from the BMA early on about the, what you would need to do to get the license and what would be their minimum criteria. So, haven't really been in that situation, which is great.
Right. Yeah. And not all jurisdictions can claim that. By being thoughtful up front, I think Bermuda has avoided the knee-jerk reaction of having to say, "Oh, okay, we can't do this. I'm so sorry," and nobody can operate in our jurisdiction this year, or it's they've avoided the fits and starts that other jurisdictions have suffered, honestly, on it.
They've had to backtrack, exactly. Yeah. And I think the other thing that I haven't we mentioned that it's an insurance reinsurance. Known for its insurance and strength in reinsurance and insurance. And there is actually a specific sandbox for insurance companies and intermediaries providing innovative solutions around insurance. So you effectively come out of the sandbox into an appropriate insurance class. So it's it's this idea of supporting through the scaling up. Most recently, the BMA has just put out a consultation paper around the introduction of a general regulatory sandbox. So if you are looking to do any of the other regulated business activities, such as investment business, funds, etc., trusts, and you're looking to sort of innovate in those sectors, then there is going to be a sandbox option under those pieces of legislation too. So it is, they're really trying to be the regulator that supports businesses and helps them scale up, which is great. So on the one hand, we're seeing very large players in the space, large crypto exchanges, institutional kind of players coming to Bermuda and looking to see what they can do here. We're also not leaving behind those startups and wanting to sort of cultivate them through their whole life cycle.
Now, Bermuda enjoys a high risk rating for AML. Mm-hmm. Better than the US. I don't know if everybody knows that, but Bermuda's up there. Yeah. And so with all the new VASP related guidance from VATF, what is, have you spoken to the regulators? Are things going to change with regards to regulating VASPs, for mm-hmm. AML in Bermuda?
I don't think so. And the reason I say that is because if you are a licensed digital assets business, you'll be a regulated financial institution. So we've had AML and ATF rules that take into account FATF recommendations alongside the digital assets licensing right from the get-go. And they are changing those as FATF makes recommendations. So most recently, looking at changes to our regulations to take into account the travel rule, for example, and understanding exactly what that means. But there is a requirement generally for a business to conduct itself prudently in a prudent manner, which takes into account sort of international standards such as FATF, etc. in any event. So, you will come here and you will know that you need to comply with AML and ATF insofar as it relates to your business. You will have specific regulations that are sector specific to digital assets businesses. So that will set out what Bermuda sees as the inherent risks of dealing in digital assets and acting as a digital asset service provider that are similar in content, obviously, to what's being recommended by FATF. Bermuda recently went through the mutual evaluation. CFATF mutual evaluation came out with, flying colors because it has been sort of living those standards for the longest time. Again, as a practitioner, I won't lie if sometimes that's a challenge because, business often sort of steers away from regulation, which is why I say it's important if you're coming to Bermuda to lean into it. But more and more I see the benefits of leaning into regulation and the inevitability of it. And we're seeing people leaving some of those other jurisdictions that are now facing issues with their evaluations, for example, and coming to Bermuda because they're actually finding that the pendulum is swinging the other way. Whereas we've been pretty consistent. We will comply with international standards. We will make sure to the extent possible that we are not a place that is used to launder illicit funds, whether that be fiat or digital assets. And, the risks around that new sector were evaluated at the time the strategy was implemented by the government. Our National Anti-Money Laundering Committee always keeps those front of mind and moves in line with the changes. So, it's just the way that the world is these days. We need to be cognizant of our regulatory requirements, and they're encroaching. Whether or not you are in a regulated jurisdiction. So, again, I think there is some scope though for a company to interpret them and apply them on a risk-based perspective. That's sort of, again, the mantra within those guidelines. But there's certainly a lot of information that helps you determine what rules will apply and what won't.
Excellent. And you mentioned other jurisdictions that might be contemplating Bermuda, or businesses in other jurisdictions. Where do you find that that some of those pivots are occurring from other jurisdictions? Yeah,
so it's global, really. We see it kind of comes in waves based, to be honest, on the regulatory reactions onshore or outside of Bermuda generally. So when the EU or the FCA indicates that it's going to be more stringent on some of the innovation around futures, CFDs, etc. We saw a lot of activity, and in response, Bermuda expressly amended the Digital Assets Business Act to include derivatives based on digital assets, so that we can offer certainty that yes, you will be within the licensing regime, you will need to get a license, but we'll do it on a risk-based perspective, and we'll try and understand your business and license it appropriately, and expect you to come to live up to our standards. But with that, you'll get the benefit of a collaborative regulator who will innovate with you. And so we see that. We've seen a lot of interest given the position in the United States with respect to some of the activities of the bigger institutional players around sort of lending, borrowing, and other activities. We are seeing movement away from jurisdictions where there is no regulation, but there is expected to be regulation coming, and you don't know what that's going to look like. And it could look like A or B, but ultimately, you can't operate a business with not knowing. So again, that certainty of, well, at least if I come to Bermuda, I'll get some, I'll know where the regulatory perimeter lies. And again, where it's ambiguous, we have an excellent relationship with the regulator, and we can go to them and we can say, look, we have a business that is looking at doing this, and our view, it's in or it's out of scope. What's yours? And for the most part, they'll sort of help us. Obviously, they don't give legal advice, they don't give guidance to specific companies in that way, but they'll help us understand their interpretation of the legislation, so that we can be clear with our advice to our clients. So I don't feel too often that I'm exposed as a practitioner, sort of, I don't know, really. I normally can get the answer, even if the answer is no, you couldn't do that here without a license. And that's a great place to be for your clients, for practicing in this space, to be able to be certain in an area where there's so much uncertainty. And so it tends to ebb and flow. I mean, we literally have interest from, this is a global sector, so it's hardly surprising, but we have interest from all regions for all different reasons, and hopefully mainly because of the flexibility that we can offer.
Right. And I suppose that DeFi isn't one of those businesses that is checking out Bermuda, right?
Oh yeah, no, we are very much alive to the potential, the opportunity, and the sort of risks around DeFi, as is our regulator. I think their current position is to sort of watch and see what happens, and we feel and they feel that the licensing framework that we have is clear enough. And you'll look at a DeFi network and try and figure out whether it truly is something that is actually conducting a business activity that ought to be licensed, or whether it's decentralized and there isn't it's more along the lines of a software technology development company, and those are outside of the scope of Bermuda's digital assets license framework. So there is a possibility to come to Bermuda and set up a decentralized network. We do have vehicles that can help with companies limited by guarantee, for example, that you could set up to operate for the purposes of building out the network as a useful purpose for the purposes of our legislation. And they don't have shareholders. You would have a guarantee member. You would still have a director. So, you still have somewhat of a centralized company. But ultimately, you can operate that as a not-for-profit and often achieve the goal of decentralization. And the regulator will become relevant as and when you stray into something that generates a business activity and is being provided to the public, basically.
Right. Well, in DeFi's case, I guess, just to go like any participant on the network, right now, I know a lot of DeFi applications may whitelist certain things, but in terms of actually collecting information on the participants, that's sort of, to a large extent, against the overall thrust of what DeFi is supposed to do.
Yep. Understood.
Does that fly in the face of the AML regulations in Bermuda? Does it,
Undoubtedly. I mean, at the end of the day, if you are within scope of DABA, you are going to have to apply AML and ATF requirements to your business, which means verifying the identity of participants on the network and understanding what transactions are happening and being able to monitor those transactions. That is something that is a trade-off. And there are a number of reasons why you wouldn't want to be regulated. There are a number of reasons why you would be. What I would say is it's important to establish yourself in a jurisdiction where it's clear whether or not you need a license, because you don't want to sort of fall foul of the regulators. And if you are in a jurisdiction where you can safely do business, but is nonetheless a reputable jurisdiction, then I would think that that's quite appealing to a network that's trying to launch something that might be appealing to participants, etc. So we do have it. We are seeing it, and the regulator is very alive to it. And at this stage isn't going to be prescriptive, I don't think, in the short term over licensing it in its own right. Rather, does it constitute an activity that is licensable in Bermuda? But it's interesting. It's a very interesting space.
Yeah, for sure. So, the whole space is, and it keeps evolving, right?
Definitely.
So if let's say that somebody is looking to situate in Bermuda, because obviously, as you noted, I think having presence is a part of it. You can't just simply, I don't think it's a particularly great, going through the DABA process. And this is true for a lot of jurisdictions. You can't expect to run it completely remotely, right?
No, the BMA's recently published some guidance around head office, though, because it recognizes it's a digital sector. So, increasingly, the centralized governance function won't be in Bermuda or will already exist somewhere else. The important thing, depending on the license class, is to comply with our minimum licensing criteria. So if you have a Class D, the sort of test license that I mentioned, which is typically sort of 6 to 12 months to allow you to obtain proofs of concept, to do the beta testing, to sort of establish a minimum viable product. That doesn't come with a head office requirement. It's recognized that you're here for that purpose, and it would be unduly onerous to require you to sort of have physical presence in the jurisdiction. When you come to the Class M modified and the full license, they are looking for you to have what we call a head office, which means that you must be managed and directed. The Bermuda entity must be managed and directed from Bermuda. So the senior management meet in Bermuda to take key decisions and operational decisions, strategic decisions in Bermuda. to the extent possible because of COVID. So that could be board meetings, it could be senior management meetings. There is a requirement to have somebody called a senior representative, which is a local-based representative that serves as a sort of conduit to the authority in the early warning system if there's anything going wrong with the entity in terms of compliance with the regulations and breaches of cyber reporting, cyber breaches and insolvency events principally. And then beyond that, it is proportionate to the nature, scale, and complexity of the business. So, it isn't one size. I get very often asked, how many people do we have to put in Bermuda? And the answer is, it depends. And that is a very frustrating answer for clients I get. But you have to think carefully about, what does it look like to operate the type of business that we have outside of Bermuda, and feed into the centralized global business. So, it may be having a permanent presence of key officers in the jurisdictions, compliance, maybe a trading, or it may be that. I mean, the idea is that there will be businesses here in the same way that we've seen in the insurance and reinsurance sector that will grow the talent pool of available persons to fill those roles in Bermuda. So it's a push and a pull with that regard. That they do recognize that it is necessary where necessary to bring in talent, because it simply isn't available locally. And for that, you will receive assistance in the form of incentives around work permits. So, there will be a number of work permits, I think it's 5 or 6, available to bring in persons from overseas to set up your business where it warrants it. And if you have just newly formed, you'll get sort of 5 or 6 without the requirement to do a local advertisement and prove that there isn't a suitably qualified local persons. But I mean, as I said, what we're seeing is that actually the presence of those types of individuals in the jurisdiction represents a fantastic opportunity for local Bermudians to train and to acquire talent. What we're also seeing is that there's a lot of transferability from the international business sector that's already here. So the insurance companies, those working in that sector can often transfer to the fintech space as well. We have banks here, we have brokers here, we have lots of intellectual capital that can be leveraged. But yes, it is not a question of one board meeting a year and a registered office, PO box. That isn't what it's about. And I'm pleased with that. I think if you it's important from a regulatory perspective that you have the ability to oversee the companies that are here, and who's here, and what they're doing.
Right. I remember back when we were pursuing the license ourselves. Project didn't ultimately go anywhere, but I was actually looking forward to the director meetings. I'm like, okay, so I have to go to Bermuda a few times a year. I can do that. Yeah. I can go more than a few times a year. It's Bermuda, for God's sakes.
It's great that you knew that, because a lot of people go, how do you get there? It's like, well, it's less than a 2-hour flight from New York, believe it or not. So a 2.5-hour flight from Miami. It's very, very doable. But yeah, we're not having too much difficulty in having people wanting to come and spend periods of time in Bermuda setting up businesses. We actually have a digital nomad scheme where you can come and work from Bermuda for a business situated outside of Bermuda, and you can reside and work for that company in Bermuda for a year, and so we've had a lot of influx of so-called digital nomads that are in the sector as well, and they come and they see that there is a real industry here, if you like. There is a real city where you can meet accountants, insurance brokers, bankers, lawyers, administrators, all your service providers. You can actually sit and have a coffee. So if you do plan that business trip, you can achieve quite a lot in that trip. And you will have access likely to the regulator and possibly to the government ministers that are necessary to achieve your business goals during that time that you're here. So it's a real presence, which is nice.
Right, and you also get to see the business attire, which is like what, shorts. So what do they call that again? Where you wear shorts and you wear like knee-high socks with shorts. What's that called again?
It's Bermuda short. I mean, you wear Bermuda shorts. They are, specifically just above the knee with long blue socks, typically, and they are the shorts are usually extremely bright, acrid colors, and then a blazer with a shirt and tie. So
and that's business wear. That's business attire. That's business attire. I love it. It was fantastic.
Yeah. Actually, the worst thing about work from home is that you didn't really see too much of that, but it's coming back, and we still see that on a regular occasion. A regular occurrence. It's nice.
Yeah, if we would have gone the DABA license, and I would have gone I definitely would have invested in the Bermuda. I just would have had it done it. Like I'd be the guy walking up. I'd be like, "Hey, I'm here." When in Rome, right? Do like the Romans. So exactly. Phenomenal. But I digress a little bit. But I had to throw that in. Going to Bermuda wasn't a sacrifice, and again, it is very convenient to go to as well. So let's say that a company does this exact, checks things out in Bermuda, determines it checks all the boxes if they want to locate here. They want to go ahead with the digital asset business license. What's it look like? It's different than when we looked at it.
Yeah, it is. So I touched on, the process has been refined as we've gone through sort of almost 4 years of licensing businesses now, which again, I think is a differentiator between Bermuda and other countries that are maybe sort of, just implementing their licensing framework. We've sort of lived and breathed it for a while. So as a result, the licensing time is really quite reasonable, I think, is the feedback that we get. So depending on the license class, I mean, if you have a class T, as I said, lower barriers to entry, you could find that license being issued within sort of a matter of weeks, potentially. If you certainly under 2 months, if you are looking at a class M or an F, we're looking at sort of anything between 2 to 3 to 6 months, depending on really how fast you're prepared to go. I mean, I can definitely speak to the fact that, the regulator will move as swiftly as you deliver them the information. So they commit to responding to a license application within 2 weeks. Oftentimes it's less than that. They'll come back for initial feedback. But what's great is the BMA is prepared to front end the process. So they will look at drafts before you've even submitted the formal submission. Yep. And they will give you very detailed feedback on those drafts so that by the time you put that submission in, you've already taken into account a number of their questions. The idea is to get to sort of the point where they don't really have any more questions. And that process can go as quickly or as slowly as you wish it to. And often, you're competing with bandwidth in the organization and other projects and whatever else. So it doesn't always go in a sort of fast process, but it can. And they will, following the application, they will confirm licensing. I mean, they commit to giving, I think it's up to 4 weeks. Honestly, they're much tighter on their times than that. We get feedback almost immediately. So, it is a genuinely swift process, not light touch. I wouldn't describe it as that. They really will get granular with your business, and they'll want to understand that you understand your business and the risks that are associated with it. So, you would come with a good sense of what the business model is. You would expect to provide a business plan. Depending on the license class, you will need to have a risk and compliance framework that's either, not yet developed, partially developed, or fully developed. And you can sort of aim at the appropriate license class depending on where you are in your license life cycle. So we're very actively engaged on all classes of license. So it's not that we're only seeing the full or the modified. We're seeing a number of the class Ts since that's been introduced. So it's the full range. And as I said, the way that we operate is that we would work on the business plan first with the client, look at their AML policies, procedures. We can offer we have a regulatory compliance company that can provide services to help you build fully out your compliance framework, and develop the risk assessment and the AML policies and procedures that go with that, and all of the other sort of risk and compliance procedures and policies and procedures that you need. And then we would go with a draft of that business plan for feedback to the BMA first. And then once we'd have that feedback, gather everything and do the formal submission. So, it's a very iterative, collaborative process. And I think what we do here is there isn't any rules. Like what does that mean for my business? And the question is, well, what does that mean for your business? You're expected to sort of take the rules and develop them within your own risk appetite, within your own business model, depending on what you're doing, depending on how complex it is, depending how much volume is coming through. There are all different sort of factors that you need to take into account when you build out policies and procedures. So they want you to do that. It's not cut and paste at all.
Right. No, and the whole thing about being able to submit drafts, I just want to kind of underscore that, because even a few years ago, again, I'm talking from my own personal experience, that draft sharing, it takes on a very different it's a much more collaborative process. And I know we use the word collaborative, but to just kind of double click, like, in the US, sometimes you'll submit an application and then you have to wait until all the feedback, it goes through everything. You could be waiting a fair amount of time to get that feedback, and then you have to respond. But that whole process can create delays. Whereas what I found in Bermuda was that when we submitted components of our application, we didn't have to have everything together. We wanted to kind of get feedback to help us understand the whole process. They came back with very thoughtful comments, and we didn't sit there saying, "Oh, they don't get it," which is, it's nice to have a regulator that's thoughtful, trying to get to the right place. Like, it was a conversation. It was like they were learning, we were learning, but it felt, again, it was. And the timing of it was very impressive. So we had a very good experience of getting feedback, and it really helped clarify a number of things for us. And it was, we didn't have to go through a whole process of waiting a fair amount of time. Then the process was longer by definition, just because it was newer. But but with that collaboration, I kind of felt like things just moved a lot more smoothly, and not with fits and starts. So And
I think, they don't presume, the BMA doesn't presume to sort of they understand the tech, they understand the risks, they understand the service providers, they know who's in the space, they know who the players are, they know the nature of the business, but they don't presume to sort of know your business, that they will take into account nuances, different innovations, different products, different services, really try and understand it. And they're looking at the risk to customers, the risk to potential investors, and the risk to the jurisdiction. Those are their three sort of, primary objectives, is to make sure that you mitigate those risks, that you have the appropriate controls to enable you to mitigate those properly. And any prudent business, that's what you want to do. We all want to make money, we all want to be innovative, but you've got to be careful about how you do that. And obviously that way, hopefully weed out those who are nefarious and unfortunately using the tech for the wrong purposes.
Right. We didn't talk about ICOs at all. Bermuda has also, if you do an ICO within Bermuda, right? And this is only within, not without, meaning not outside of Bermuda, right? As I recall. But if you do it within Bermuda, you need to go through an ICO registration process.
Yeah, so they changed the legislation in 2020 to bring authorizations for digital assets issuances to the public within the purview of the authority, so the Bermuda Monetary Authority. Previously, the government had the right to sort of approve them. So now it's sitting with the regulator. And so if you conduct a digital assets issuance to the general public from within Bermuda, so basically if you're a Bermuda entity doing it, or you're a foreign entity that does it in Bermuda, then you will need to seek the authorization. And so it's not a full license, it's an authorization. You'll need to demonstrate that your offering document, which is filed with the authority, contains minimum information around risk disclosures, and obviously that is modified to see who you're actually offering the making the offer to, and you will need to comply with AML and ATF requirements, and file a post-issuance report to the BMA, sort of auditing what has happened in terms of the issuance. There are exemptions to that. So if you are making an offer to qualified investors, so effectively similar to sophisticated investors or accredited investors, then you don't need to do that sort of authorization and process and publication of the prospectus process, or offering document rather. Equally, if you conduct your issuance on the platform of a digital assets business that has a license in Bermuda and is an accredited digital assets business, then that digital assets business can effectively operate as almost like a self-regulatory organization and acts as the sort of vetter of the issuer. And so the BMA would not in that circumstance require you to publish and file the document with the regulator. And so it's sort of setting up those accredited digital assets business to operate a little bit more like traditional stock exchanges. And so I think that's really, again, innovative and intuitive to the growth of this sector, what exchanges want to be, how they want to operate, and just shows the sort of the regulatory approach. The regulator will be comfortable that it licenses the exchange, and that exchange can therefore operate within that framework, but as an SRO. And I think, that's super interesting, and we'll have to see how that grows in the sector.
Right. And as I recall, at least at the time, filing for an ICO wasn't all that onerous. We had actually gotten approval for an ICO, and I'd done the application, but it wasn't, it wasn't, it took a few weeks. I mean, it wasn't.
Yeah, it's a different process than the licensing for sure. It's an authorization. They just want to know that you're, what you're offering is real. Really. I mean, it's little. We haven't seen so many public issuances. Whether or not that's because they're falling within exemptions, there are other exemptions I didn't mention, or whether or not that's just because of the sort of nature of the market. But it's there, and it isn't, as you say, too onerous. It's pretty sensible authorization route for a regulator.
Right. And so when we spoke, you indicated that there's much more coming into Bermuda now. There's much more interest, a lot of issuers. And where are you seeing, you mentioned the jurisdictional migration, people who are looking to lean into it, but do you note any particular trends, things that are worth mentioning in terms of like who's looking or coming into, looking to come into Bermuda now?
No, I mean, I think we've got a lot of activity happening in Bermuda itself, which is interesting, and which I think will bring people to our shores just because of what's happening here. So we have imminently a licensed digital bank, hopefully, which will be the first in 40 years to set up in Bermuda, that will offer digital assets businesses the full suite of services on and off ramps, etc., stable coins. So that's super exciting, and I expect that will bring people to Bermuda because we have a banking solution that works. I think, to be fair, the existing banks have come around to digital assets businesses, and at least one of them is actively banking them as well. And so, there's a banking solution there. There is a lot of insurance, as you can imagine. It is the place to do insurance. So we're seeing a lot of insurance companies coming that are looking to do innovative structures. Again, I think the infrastructure around digital assets is an important piece for Bermuda. And so we're seeing service providers, intermediaries, fund administrators, managers looking at Bermuda as an option to sort of put their digital strategies into play. And not least, my colleague, Sarah Demeling, who is one of Bermuda's she is the best funds lawyer in Bermuda. She is seeing a ton of instructions around funds with crypto strategies, both just sort of crypto native funds, but also more kind of innovative structures, including we have a segregated accounts vehicle, and it's called the Incorporated Segregated Accounts Company. So we can set up a company which has individual incorporated segregated accounts for you to run different strategies through, and the assets and liabilities associated with each different strategy will be segregated from the others. So that's really interesting in the fields of insurance and funds, and more recently digital assets. So I think that we are starting to see people coming to Bermuda because of what Bermuda can offer as well, and that's what I'm seeing. We have a very active stock exchange that is also actively looking at this sector. It's owned by Miami International Holdings, MIAX, who obviously has a number of exchanges throughout the United States, and that has signaled a different strategy for the BSX. They've listed Bitcoin ETFs already, and I expect them to sort of become much more involved and aligned with the sector as well. So I think Bermuda's got a lot to say when it's walking the walk in terms of the government is working on initiatives for the island to be able to pay government fees and taxes in digital assets, and so that's something that we would expect to be happening extremely soon, as well as sort of acceptance across the island for Bitcoin and other form of payment for services and goods. So I think that in itself is a draw. As I said, we tend to sort of see what's happening onshore as a barometer for whether or not we're going to be busy. But I'm happy to say that I've been busy for the last 12 months without a break. So hopefully that will continue.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Before we break, anything else that that maybe we didn't talk about that you wanted to share?
No, just thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you, Eric. It's great to touch base with you. It was awesome working with you, and I very much appreciated your sort of collaborative approach as well. So, and congratulations on this podcast and the success of it. And I'm looking forward to being able to get out of Bermuda and start seeing people face to face at some real conferences for a change, and doing some more live networking. But this is excellent, and I appreciate you flying the flag for the encrypted economy, certainly.
Yes, thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care.